Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Whiskey Lounge USA tasting. I hope you're all well and enjoying your Friday evening so far. I'm just going to let someone else in here. Okay. We may be interrupted once or twice just while I let people in who are booked in on the tasting, because we don't want anyone missing out. Hi, Craig. How are you doing? Now, okay, so I'm hoping that you all have your natty little USA tasting pack. Nod along if you do. If you don't, we're in trouble. This is the first deviation from Scotch-style whiskies that I think we've done in lockdown or semi-lockdown, whatever we're calling the current situation. And I'm delighted that we've got some people interested in doing it. In the past, it's been a little bit of a challenge to sell USA whiskies to folks because I think a lot of people feel they taste better in the where they're made. I think perhaps the warmer weather sometimes predictates the enjoyment of these whiskies in a hotter climate. Personally speaking, I've been enjoying a lot of American whiskies, particularly at the start of lockdown. I probably didn't go many evenings without drinking an old-fashioned or two, and we're gonna discuss or even make an old-fashioned a little bit later on. Or certainly I'm going to show you how I make an old-fashioned, which may not be exactly how everyone does it, but I don't care. It tastes good to me. Now, I'm going to throw on an on-screen presentation because you're probably sick of looking at beardy men by now on these tastings and whatever else is going on. Now, I don't normally like using PowerPoint because I find it's a bit of a lazy tool and you should be able to use your hands and your voice and everything else. But I think for online purposes, it works really well because it helps illustrate points. I don't know about yourselves, but I've never been to Kentucky. I've been to the USA many times. I have family over there, but I've never made it to Kentucky, which is the focus of most of the tasting. And therefore, it's quite useful to be able to see where these whiskies are originating from. So I'm going to pop that on in a moment. We're going to start with the first whiskey, which is the Wild Turkey Original. I'm just going to share my screen to you now. Oh, hold on, no, I'm not. Yeah. Just bear with me, I've got to adjust some settings on the computer. That could be an issue. Okay. Can you all see that okay? Yeah, great. It's not actually the... What's going on? Sorry for that. I updated my computer the other night and obviously it's played a bit of haywire with my sharing ability. So here we have obviously the map of the United States, and you can see it's fairly obvious it's a vast country. We all know that. And you can see that there are two distilleries that we're going to talk about this evening in Kentucky, which is Four Roses and the James E. Pepper Distillery. And then right to the west, Oregon, we've got Westwood, which we're going to talk about towards the end, which is a quite exciting single malt whiskey from the USA, which is not a style most people have tasted as of yet. For obvious reasons, it's never really been that widely available, certainly in the UK. but we're going to see more and more of these coming through. I've also marked on the map there, it says MGP ingredients, which doesn't sound very sexy or very whiskey, but I'll talk more about that. It's possibly one of the most important distilleries in the USA, and it is relevant to the tasting tonight, as you'll see. So we're gonna talk about Four Roses to begin with, and Four Roses is obviously a very historic brand. Most of you have probably come across it at some point or rather. It's not always been looked after well. Certainly Seagram, who generally speaking were a very good custodian of alcoholic drinks, who owned Four Roses, decided to stop marketing it as a quality or premium bourbon brand in the US. So it suffered quite a great deal because of that, because they essentially retained the brand, but they only used it for what we call American blended whiskies, which are not necessarily the best. You know, in terms of quality, they would be seen as subpar in comparison to what we're going to be tasting this evening. So there's been quite a bit of a recovery job for them to do, and it kind of coincided. I think it was around 1994 when the then distillery manager took over, Jim Routledge, who became quite a legend in the industry, and he resurrected this idea of using multiple mash bills and multiple yeast strains in order to produce quite different styles of whiskey, not even taking into account casks and maturation. So what's really interesting about Four Roses is, if you take Scotch whiskey as the kind of dominant example, Scotch whiskey producers use cask maturation as a really easy and clever way of manipulating flavor, manipulating and enhancing and creating different flavors with the final product. With Four Roses, it starts a lot earlier than that. It starts with, as I say, the mash bill. Now, what is a mash bill? I tell you what, why don't we have a dram while we're talking about this? Because I don't know about you, but I have had a beer, but that's it. And I'm feeling the need for a dram. So we'll start with the Four Roses original. Now, what I would just say is that I'm going to be making an old fashioned later on. Now, you could, if you wanted to, keep one of the bourbon samples aside and try and make an old fashioned with that. In reality, it's not really enough to be making an old fashioned out of. Unfortunately, we couldn't afford to send you that much, because I would recommend at least 50 ml in an old fashioned. So you might want to just watch what I do when I do it, make a few notes, or watch the video back whenever and have a go at it. I'm hoping you might have a cheeky little bottle of bourbon in your collection anyway, in which case you can make along, but perhaps using a different bourbon, but that's absolutely fine. But anyway, so this is the Four Roses original. Let's have a little taste of this while we're going through. Now, obviously with bourbon, it's a completely different set of flavors than with single malt or Scotch whiskies in general, Scotch style whiskies from around the world. And the slide there helps illustrate that. So on the right hand side, you can see malted barley, which is what most Scotch whiskies, the basis of their being, if you like. It's certainly how Scotch whiskey started out as malt whiskey. However, in the United States, the cereals on the left are far more important. And the main reason for that is, they were the predominant grains in the United States. So rye at the bottom is grown mainly more to the north and to the east of the country. And certainly rye would have been the first type of whiskey made in the United States as the settlers came in from the from the northeast coast and found rye growing there already, and start, would eventually start making distilled spirit from it. And then as they started to take themselves further south and west, they would have started to see corn being grown, and then obviously corn whiskey, and then bourbon eventually. Malted barley is still important to the makeup of, or the DNA of, bourbon and rye, because without it, it's very, very difficult to have any kind of fermentation going on. Malted barley contains essential enzymes that are required during the fermentation process, which otherwise the yeast would find it very, very difficult to break down the sugars and convert to alcohol. So malted barley is very, very important in that respect. There is a method of using liquid enzymes rather than malted barley, but it's kind of frowned upon a little bit because it's not as natural as using a cereal as an additive rather than the liquid enzymes. So it is still very important. And obviously with the final sample later on, the Westwood, we've got a single malt whiskey in there anyway. Just to show you around Four Roses a little bit, the distillery cooker, which is essentially what we would call the mash tun in Scotch whiskey terms. That's where the cereals are married together, and we start to flush the crushed up cereals into what we would call a wort in Scottish terms, but into a mash, into a kind of porridge, watery porridge. And then on the right, you've got a fermenter, which we would call a washback in Scotch terms. And essentially that's where the alcohol production starts to begin. So within that I won't say fermenter, but fermenter, yeast would be added to the sugary porridge, and you would start to see fermentation. In Four Roses, it's a pretty long ferment. In some distilleries, the fermentation time might be only 36, 48 hours. So 75 to 90 hours is quite long, which is quite important, and I'll talk about that. The reason it's 75 to 90 hours is that it will be based on the season, so how warm it is particularly, and essentially you wouldn't need to ferment it for quite as long in the hot season, but you would need to ferment it a little longer in the cold season to produce the requisite flavors that you want. Now, how are we getting on with the Four Roses? Now, I would suggest, someone was saying earlier on, can I add Coke to it? And I would say it's your drink. You do what you like to it. It's entirely up to you. Oh, I've got a question. Hold on a second. I'm trying.
Just to be clear, I was joking, by the way. Sorry.
Well, it worked. Oh, I appreciate that.
I saw you die inside slightly then, thinking there's only two on, and one of them must have put Pepsi in it. No, I was only messing, don't worry.
Very occasionally, I'll add Coke to it. Don't worry about it. So, what I would suggest, if I was drinking this using a big glass like this, which is what I'll be doing later, then I'd probably have a big lump of ice in it. And the main reason for that is that ice for bourbon just helps temper the really kind of big, spicy, intense flavors, which are not always that approachable. And what ice tends to do is just dilutes it slightly, cools it down. I tend to steer away from using ice in single malt whiskey, mainly because I find personally that it dumbs it down too much. Single malt Scotch whiskey styles tend to be more delicate than American bourbon rye styles of whiskey. So I would always suggest water with Scotch style whiskies, but I have no problem with ice, particularly in bourbon style or USA whiskies. So, but I'm going to add in my cute little jug here a few drops of water to the, God, I made a mess of that. I'm not going to add too much because the original is only bottled at 40%. I mean, I say only 40% ABV is still nothing to be, nothing to sniff at. But the reason I add water to it is that I'm trying to extract as much flavor information from the whiskey as possible. And the best way of doing that is to add water to the whiskey. Ideally, you want to add a spring water, something very low in mineral content. Certainly, if you can avoid it, don't use tap water because it contains chlorine, fluoride, and you know, stuff that's meant to keep us healthy, but doesn't always taste good. So if you've got spring water, then always use that. I'm going to add a tiny bit more. Now, the more water you add to the whiskey, the more of the subtle fragrances you should pick out of the whiskey. Now, you know, I would caveat all of this by saying that tasting or analyzing US styles of whiskey is probably the most challenging of whiskey tastings because by their very nature, they taste quite similar. Which we can explore a little bit about. I'm just looking around. I was looking for a cask, but anyway, well, not a cask, a stave. Now, how are we getting on with that? So you probably notice if you've added water to it that it's just calmed the alcohol aromas down, which are really, really redolent in I find in a lot of bourbons, and just starting to release some of the lighter aromas. So I'm getting quite sort of herbal and light spiciness. You certainly you should get vanilla. I mean, vanilla is kind of ever present in bourbon, and that's to do with the oak that it's matured in, and particularly the way the oak is treated before the whiskey goes into the cask. Give it a little taste. Yeah, it's like cream soda and toffee apples and things like that. It's just a very nice way to start the evening. I hope you agree. So I was alluding to the fact that the fermenter is very important, particularly to Four Roses, because it's very what's unusual and unique about Four Roses is the fact that they are very vociferous about what they do fermentation wise. So and it's not just the yeast they use, it's the fact that they use two different mash bills. Now, a mash bill is simply the recipe card, if you like, for each distillery. So for Four Roses, for example, the two mash bills, one is 60% corn and I think 35% rye, or 25% rye, or I can't remember, I think it's 35% rye and 5% malted barley, whereas the other recipe is 75% corn, 20% rye, 5% malted barley. So that's a mash bill essentially. What makes up that whiskey, if you like. Now, to qualify as bourbon, it must be at least 51% corn in that mash bill. The rest of it can be made up of rye, wheat, and malted barley. But realistically, you do get wheated bourbons, and a wheated bourbon is simply a bourbon which has wheat, as the secondary component in the mash bill. So instead of rye, so you might have 60% corn and 30% wheat and 10% malted barley, and that would make it a wheated bourbon. And wheat whiskies are quite interesting. Probably of the American whiskies I've tasted, and I haven't. Wheat whiskey is quite hard to find. I can only think of one in the UK, but there are one or two others I know floating about. But possibly my least favorite. It doesn't quite have the same guts as corn-based or rye-based whiskies. And it's funny as well in Scottish grain whiskies. So grain whiskey would be the Scottish equivalent of bourbon. So there are around 9 grain distilleries in Scotland, and only one of them still uses corn. Most of them used to use corn, but most of them now use wheat. And the one that I find, to my taste, to be the nicest, if that's the right word, would be North British, which is the last one really to use corn. So keep an eye out for that, because single grain whiskey is really good value. But anyway, so what do you think of that? Do you like that? Do you like American whiskeys normally, or is this a first go? Yes. Okay. So I'm preaching to the converted, really. So yes. So 2 different mash bills at Four Roses, which is unusual enough. Most distilleries will have one mash bill for, if not one of their brands, or maybe all of their brands. Bourbon bourbon producers, the big bourbon producers, tend to produce a lot of different brands. So it looks like there are lots and lots of distilleries in Kentucky, when there's actually only 8 or 9, or possibly more now with the craft movement. But if you look on the shelves in duty free or wherever, bourbon specialists, you can see literally dozens, if not more, bourbon brands, and that's because the distilleries often buy different brands and keep them under their wing. So the likes of Buffalo Trace, for example, has I would say at least 10 different brands of bourbon under its wing. Four Roses is actually quite unusual in that it is only Four Roses. So yeah. So not only 2 mash bills, but 5 different proprietary yeast strains. So they actually grow their own yeast on site to use with the fermenter here, which gives, if you think about it, an almost limitless number of possibilities in terms of flavor. I was lucky enough to sit in a tasting some years ago, probably about 20 years ago, with Jim Routledge and Dave Broom, and we went through about 20 samples of all the different variations of the mash bills and the yeast strains, and the differences were, not just slightly different, but really, really different. And it was so exciting because it's not something that you see in Scotch whiskey, generally speaking. You don't see many Scotch style producers actually playing about with yeasts. I know it doesn't sound very sexy, but from a whiskey producing point of view and from a sheer potential of flavor and differences, is massively exciting. And I think if you were to ask me in what way do you see whiskey developing in the future, I think that yeast strains could be something that we see more of. The problem is that yeast is not as sexy a word as cask or wood finishing. Let's face it, it's not. It doesn't kind of slip off the tongue. So that's the only problem. I think it's not as marketable, and unfortunately for everyone, marketing is king. Selling the whiskey is the ultimate goal for most distilleries. Now there are some distilleries that are experimenting. There's one actually I'm sure there is more than one, but the one that I'm aware of particularly is the Lakes Distillery in Cumbria in England. which is actually Davil, who's the whiskey maker there. He does play around with yeasts in the fermentation. So we may see some interesting stuff coming out from there. Well, there already is some interesting stuff coming out from there, but in terms of talking about yeast. Anyway, we'll move on. So distilling in the USA is traditionally quite different. On the right-hand side, you see something quite familiar. Looks like a pot still, and that's what it is. It's essentially a pot still, but it is secondary to the main process, which is going on the two column stills on the left-hand side. Now, a pot still is one of the easiest things to kind of explain in terms of distillation, because it's basically just a giant copper kettle that you boil using a heat source from underneath. You pump the beer into the bottom of the, or into the pot, and as the heat brings the liquid to a boil, the alcohol vapor lifts from the rest of the liquid, because alcohol is a lower boiling point than water, and then it goes up the swan neck and it's condensed into liquid. The guys on the left, the column still, is almost like dark arts in compared to the pot still. It's quite difficult to explain because frankly I'm not a scientist and I don't fully understand it. But essentially there's a network of copper platelets inside there. I've got there's a slide of kind of the internals, and essentially it's forcing multiple distillations at each point that you can see between the two columns, and it's allowing for a greater level of purification and therefore amplification of alcohol. It's what allows us to make the likes of gin and vodka, because you can distill in these vessels, you could distill up to 100% ABV if you so wished. For bourbon, they only distill up to around 65-70% ABV, or in their language, 130, 140 proof. The proof system in the USA is slightly different to the UK. So proof in the US is actually just exactly double what we would call the ABV. So something at 40% ABV in the UK would be 80 proof in the US. The UK, if you were to apply our proof system to, is slightly more complicated. It doesn't work out at double. So 100 proof in our system works out at 57% alcohol. Don't ask me why the difference is. I can't remember. I probably do, but I've forgotten. But anyway, so most American whiskies would use some variant of this column still that you see. We'll look at, when we look at James E. Pepper a little bit later on, we'll see quite how different column stills can look to each other, because these ones at Four Roses are quite large, and if we're talking about production size, they've just extended so that I think they've doubled the number of stills and fermenters. So they now have gone from being able to make, where is it? I've got it on a slide here. So they were making up to 65,200 litre barrels a year. They're now able to make 130,200 litre barrels, which is a lot of whiskey when you think about it. Bourbon as a category is second only to Scotch whiskey in terms of sales globally. But scarily, most of that bourbon is made by two distilleries, and one of them isn't Four Roses. So that 130,000 barrels, whilst it sounds like a lot, it's actually not that much in comparison to some of the biggest. So Jim Beam would be one of the biggest, and it would make probably 4 or 5 times that, if not more. So Four Roses is still quite a small niche producer. And, you know, as I said before, Seagram didn't do them any favors in terms of raising the profile of the brand until the 90s, when it was brought back into the fold. And you can see single story warehouses in Kentucky there. So they actually bottle, warehouse and bottle Four Roses at a local level. So the distillery is in one area of Lawrenceburg, whereas the warehousing, the bottling plant, is a little way down the way. It's not a million miles away. So, which is again is quite unusual. Most Scotch distillers these days would bottle quite some distance from their distillery. They would tanker it off to the Scottish Central Belt and have it bottled there. Now, in your pack, I tried to fit as much information as possible into here, but then you do have the kind of recipe card for the bourbons here. But then I was looking at it this evening thinking, oh my goodness me, I can't read that. I can just about read it. So you might want to put it under a little, put your phone camera over it with a magnifying on it or something, because it is very interesting. So you can see each of the whiskies that we're going to taste tonight. The yellow original, you can see, uses all 10 possibilities. So each of both mash bills, and both mash bills using each 5 of the proprietary yeasts. So it's actually a little bit of everything, which is quite interesting. It's a bit of a mishmash. The small batch that we're about to taste uses 2 of each. So this is the small batch. So that's your second whiskey. Now, small batches, you'll notice, bottled at 45% ABV or 90 proof. And again, what strikes me about American whiskies, generally speaking, is how good value they are. When you see the word small batch on a bottle of Scotch whiskey, that could mean anything from, 5-6 casks, but normally up to, 100 casks or more. This small batch from Four Roses is literally just 4 casks. So it's a cask of each type of the mash bill and yeast strain as I mentioned before. So that's tiny. That's a really small output, and it's only, well, at the moment it's less than 30 quid, which I think is just ludicrous value for money. I think for the same level of exclusivity or rarity or uniqueness in a single malt whiskey, I think you'd be looking at least 2, maybe 3 times the cost of that. But let's have a look at it. Just going to turn that off for a minute. How are you getting on, everyone? Okay. Any questions so far? No?
So far, no.
Not so far. Okay.
Yeah.
So, oh, hand up. Hold on a sec.
This doesn't happen to be a dry state, does it? Like where they make Jack Daniels. That's all I'm asking.
Yeah, right. No, Kentucky is not dry. Tennessee isn't dry anymore.
All right.
It was until relatively recently, but yeah, no. I mean, and there are still one or two dry states in the US, as you know, but Kentucky is definitely not a dry state.
Right.
That would prove very difficult for a state that produces so much whiskey. Anyway, was that it?
That's it. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're on to the small batch. What do we make of this? So, do you find it different to the yellow label? Try a little bit of water, yes? It's funny, I find it, even at that slightly higher alcohol level, I find it has a little bit more subtlety than the yellow label. It's just doesn't have quite the same intensity of vanilla. There seems to be a lot more, maybe a bit more chocolate, a bit more darker notes. It's funny. It kind of tastes, to my mind, slightly more easygoing than the yellow label. It's got a slightly longer, more peppery finish, I find. Yeah, very nice. Do you like that one more or less than the original? Thumbs up or thumbs up if you liked it more. Thumbs down if you like the other one. Oh, okay. We're a 50-50 split at the moment then. I have to say, I think both are good. Just do different jobs. But it's nice to see that you can see the difference between the two products there. I've kept a little bit of the original in my glass. Going back to it now. It's always good to keep a little bit in your glass if you can. If you can't, it doesn't really matter too much, because even the residue at the bottom of the glass, you'll still be able to smell that whiskey for some time to come, essentially until it dries out and crystallizes into sugar. It's funny, I find the original smells quite savory in comparison, just nosing that now. Good stuff. Okay, well, let's go back to the, if I can take you back to the screen. Let's see if this works again. There we go. So there we have the yeast and mash bill map, and you can see on the right hand side, yeast working its magic in the fermenter. The suddenness of the effect of the yeast added to the mash is quite impressive. It really doesn't waste any time in converting all that sugar to alcohol, CO2, and heat. Right. And right there is the main difference between, apart from the use of corn and rye predominantly, this is the main difference between Scotch style whiskies and bourbon style whiskies. It's the use of heavily charred, brand new American oak casks, which is something that Kentucky distillers have been using for decades now, mainly since Prohibition was repealed. As part of the new whiskey making legislation, when Prohibition was being repealed, the government recognized that all aspects of whiskey making had suffered to such a degree that it really needed a massive helping hand. And that extended all the way down to, in the process, to the production of casks. And therefore they inserted in the whiskey making legislation that bourbon and rye whiskies must be matured in brand new, heavily charred casks, American oak casks, which means that every time it's, once it's filled and emptied, that cask then has to be disposed of in one way or another. And at the same time, the Scotch industry was seeing a decline in, both a decline in wine and sherry cask availability, but also an incline in terms of sales. So it was putting a lot of pressure on them in terms of what they were storing their whiskey in. So when the Kentucky industry particularly started motoring, and there were these huge amounts of very, very good quality casks emanating from that area of the USA, Scotland took up notice and decided to start using ex-bourbon barrels in the production of Scotch whiskey, to the point where nowadays around 90%, if not more, of all Scotch whiskey being matured in Scotland is doing so in ex-bourbon white American oak casks. So it's funny how the two are almost linked in a very strong physical fashion. One could not really exist without the other. If Kentucky stopped making casks or using casks and then selling them on to Scottish distillers tomorrow, there would be real problems for the Scotch whiskey industry. Real problems, because they're so heavily reliant on them. And the one thing that they're most scared of, which may come to pass one day, is the repeal of this legislation that bourbon producers have to use brand new oak, because that would certainly mean cessation of availability of so many good quality casks. What's quite interesting is that both bourbon and rye have to use this heavily charred brand new oak to begin with, but once they've been matured for the requisite period in the classification, they are then allowed to use other cask types, or still oak, but it could be like in Scotland where you use port pipes, sherry casks, that kind of thing. So it's quite interesting that's there as well. The other interesting thing is that in Scotland, you're allowed to use spirit caramel to increase the color or darken the color in a whiskey before it's bottled. You're not allowed to do that for bourbon whiskies. It has to be that the color of the whiskey must be derived only from the maturation in cask, which a lot of bourbon producers would point to and say, we're the best because we're always au naturel. Anyway, but yeah, you can see those casks there. I did have a stave, but I think I might have left it in the car, which I was going to show you the inside of, because obviously the product of that flame on is that the inside of the cask is completely black. And there are different levels of char. There's 10 different levels of char. For American whiskey, bourbon, rye, it tends to be on the heavier end, so 8 to 10, and it's there where you're getting that kind of heavy vanilla intensity that you smell in those bourbon whiskies. Okay, and that's a 200 liter bourbon barrel. Hogshead is slightly different in that what used to happen, and still happens to a degree, is that the barrels would actually be disassembled in the US and sent over as staves to the UK, to Scotland, and then the Scottish cooperages would remake the barrels. And in a lot of cases, they would remake them into what we call hoggies or hogsheads, which is a 250 liter cask. And you do that just simply by using a couple of extra staves. So you see the staves that make up the barrel. I think it's 2 or 3 staves, and remake the cask, and it brings the capacity of that barrel up by 50 liters, and we call that a hogshead. And Quercus alba is just the technical term for American white oak. It's extremely highly sought after, not just because of the flavor it gives, but it's extremely strong, quite flexible, and very long lasting. So there are bourbon barrels still doing the rounds in the Scotch whisky industry that have been around for 100 years or more. If you look after them, and you look after them correctly, then they can last a very long time, and are therefore very good value. There was a point in time some years ago where so a sherry cask these days would cost anywhere between £800 and £1,200. That's empty, whereas a bourbon barrel would possibly cost you up to £100. So you can see, and that's mainly driven by the fact that sherry has been on the decline for a long time. None of us is drinking enough sherry, even though it can be really, really delicious. So a lot of the Scotch producers who are reliant on sherry casks have either had to start using bourbon barrels as well, or they will buy sherry bodegas and use them to season casks. So they will actually pay them to season the casks with sherry in order to ensure a steady supply of sherry casks, which seems like a very expensive way of doing things. But if that's your brand's DNA, then that's what you've got to do, right? Okay, so should we, just going to come out of there for a second. Yeah, that's a good point to hop out of there. So finally, the Four Roses single barrel. Now this, because it's from a single cask, this can only come from one of the mash recipes, the mash bill recipes. And if memory serves me, it's the rye heavy mash bill that this comes from, which is B. Or am I wrong? No, I think I'm right. Yeah, so it's the 60% corn, 30% rye. So it's the rye heavy mash bill. And I mean, we're going to be tasting rye shortly after this. So if you haven't tasted rye before, you're going to soon. But this perhaps gives you a little bit of a run up to the pure rye whiskey. And certainly I get the main characteristics of rye tend to be a sort of almost dry, peppery, very aromatic flavor or aroma from the whiskey. And I certainly get that from that single barrel. I don't know about you. It's just, rye is almost like, if you think about Coca-Cola and root beer, I don't know if you ever tried root beer before, but I remember once as a kid going to a McDonald's in Tottenham Court Road and ordering a Coca-Cola and then tasting it and thinking, oh my God, this has gone off. What's wrong with this? And then I realized a bit later on that it was actually root beer. And for me, that's not giving rye a great write-up, I know, but that's not the way I meant it. But for me, it's taken me quite a while to get into rye, because you've almost got to put aside everything that you thought you knew about the flavors of whiskey and start again. And it's similar to peated whiskies, the whiskies from Islay and elsewhere, where they make whiskies which have a smoky, iodine-y, medicinal flavor, which some people absolutely love. And I count myself as one of them. But again, if you taste an unpeated Scotch whiskey next to a peated Scotch whiskey, they're almost like different categories altogether. And a lot of people would claim that peated whiskey is not real whiskey because it tastes the way it does, that medicinal flavor. But it's equally valid. And it's the same with rye. Rye tastes the way it does because that is what rye grain, once it's been mashed, fermented, and distilled, tastes like. It's not because there's anything wrong with it at all. It's just that is the flavors you get from rye whiskey. So you just have to reset your palate for it. And hopefully this helps. So again, in terms of, I'm sorry to talk about value again, but it just shocks me every time. So this single barrel 4 Roses bourbon is less than 40 quid at the moment on certain websites. It gives you the stockist detail, or one of the stockist details on the inside there. The reason I've put them in there is simply because I was doing a search online myself and found those prices and thought, wow, okay, hopefully these guys can take advantage of that if those prices are still the same now. But yeah, I mean, again, for a single cask, single malt whiskey, I think you would be looking these days at anywhere from 50, 60 plus pounds, probably more like 80, 90 pounds a bottle. So yeah, I think again, stunningly good value, really, even if it wasn't on offer. And what are we getting from this? I get an almost slightly menthol, almost slightly minty aroma on the nose. Yeah, a slight, definitely kind of boiled sweets, maybe. I haven't added any water to it yet. I'm going to do that just now. Yeah, it's a really deep, intense aroma, whatever you think is making it. And I think that's mostly to do with the rye content in there. Mm. And when you taste it, you should straight away get that kind of aromatic rye flavor coming through. It's very dominant. I mean, you think that there's only 30% of that mash bill is rye, but it's still really, it really grips all the way down. It's very, very delicious, I think. It's maybe a little bit more late at night, sort of contemplative whiskey to be drinking. I don't think you could drink this too fast. I think you need to take your time with it and really spend some time getting to know it. Like all good friendships, they tend to take time. Yes, I think I might be trying some more of that later. Good stuff. Okay, So we're just about there in terms of Four Roses. Are there any questions at all? Are you happy with what you've tasted and what you've heard so far? Great stuff. Well, like I say, if you think of anything, just put your hand up, and we can have a little discussion at the end anyway. Okay, so we're going to move on to a different distillery now, and in fact, we're going to move on to essentially what is two distilleries involved in this next whiskey, which is possibly slightly confusing, but I'm going to explain to you why that is. Okay, so that was our hobby. So here we have the renovated and rejuvenated, it says Old Pepper Distillery, the James E. Pepper Distillery in Lexington, Kentucky, which is the original distillery was one of the most historic in the area, and James E. Pepper, who this distillery and the brand are named after, seemed to be an incredible character. It would be challenging to tell you of his exploits, but he was, by the end of it, he was a colonel. And some say that the old-fashioned cocktail was actually first invented for him back in the early 1900s, and he died in the early 1900s, not after drinking the old-fashioned, I hope. And unfortunately, the brand and the distillery kind of went with him. He was so, a case of the man or woman being the brand. He was a really early example of that, and because he was no longer around to champion the brand, it just fell by the wayside and essentially disappeared. But it was never forgotten. And in the early noughties, an ex-bartender picks up the story of James E. Pepper and decides to run with it, and decides to buy the brand, but not only that, but to rejuvenate the distillery itself. You can see it says DSP KY5. That's its original, I forget the exact term, but like registration number. So it was actually the 5th registered distillery in Kentucky, in going back in history. So it's a very historical site. And the original distillery was the first in Kentucky to actually bottle its own whiskey, because Colonel Pepper, as he was very distrustful of other distillers, and didn't want there to be any chance of his very fine bourbons and ryes being in any way contaminated or messed about with by anyone. So he insisted on being able to bottle. In fact, he sued the Kentucky county in order to allow him to do that. He was so passionate about it. So, it's great to see such a really interesting story. And I recommend, looking him up on the internet, because it's such an interesting story. And it's great to see this old historic distillery being revived. And particularly, we'll have a look on. I've got some images of the inside of it. It's absolutely gorgeous what they've done. Now, this distillery only started production in 2017. Okay, so as you can imagine, there is no mature whiskey yet from the distillery. There will be in years to come. But in the meantime, and this is quite in common with a lot of US distilleries, but also Irish distilleries, and even some Scotch distilleries, but less so. It seems to be a quirk, particularly in the US and Ireland, of using other existing distilleries' make whilst you're waiting for your own whiskey to be ready to bottle. So in the case of James E. Pepper, they wanted to reproduce a very heavy rye whiskey. I know that might sound a bit odd, a heavy rye whiskey, but in the same way that bourbon is 51% corn at least, with some rye, with some single malt, rye is flipped on its head. So it has to be at least 51% rye, with the rest being made up with corn and malted barley. Now, there's only one distillery that in the US of note that makes a lot of heavy rye, and that's this place here, which is the MGP Ingredients plant in Indiana, which is a massive distillery, and it's been producing whiskey for decades, and very, very good quality whiskey. You know, make no bones about that. It produces very, very good whiskeys, and it produces very good whiskeys for a lot of brands that don't yet distill or they either don't yet distill their own, or they're distilling and they don't have mature product yet, or perhaps they're not ever going to distill. There are some brands that have no desire to distill. They just want to be a brand of whiskey, as odd as that may sound. But MGP significantly produce a 95% rye to 5% malted barley mash bill. And that's what these guys wanted. Now, if you look at, this is the inside of the James E. Pepper, so the new distillery. At the bottom left, you can see the original drawings of the old distilling equipment. And so they've been as faithful as possible with the new. And you see that really tall, thin column still on the left-hand side, coupled to the little squat doubler, which is what they call the pot still, which essentially they use to just polish off the spirit, if you like. So it comes off the column still at around 130 proof, and then they give it a little short distillation in the doubler, which takes it up to about 135 or so. And you can see the tiny, tiny-ish fermenters on the stainless steel fermenters. And you can see that the current output is only 200 litre barrels, so it's absolutely tiny. But they do have a capacity, because it's column still you're talking about, which is very efficient. They have a potential output to take it right up to nearly 2,500 200 litre barrels. So they could certainly make a lot if they wanted to, but obviously at the moment they're keeping it to a fairly reasonable level. But I think it looks lovely. What do you think? Certainly somewhere I'd quite like to visit and avail myself, which I'm very good at, as I'm sure you can imagine. So in the meantime, if you don't have whiskey, but you want to build your brand, what do? You have options. You know, you can go and say to MGP distillers or ingredients, we'd like to buy this style of whiskey, and we're going to bottle it under our own name. And they'll be like, yeah, fine. How much do you want? And that's all it is. That's all you have to do. And so what we have here is actually a recipe that's used for quite a few different brands from the US. So you may have heard of Bullet Bourbon, which is Diageo's bourbon distillery. Now, certainly up until recently, I'm still pretty sure they do, but the Bullet Rye comes from MGP. And there's quite a few others, High West, I think, being one, and a number of others that buy their rye whiskey from MGP. The reason being is that rye is a real bitch to distill. It's really, really difficult grain to work with because it gets very messy very, very quickly in the mashing stage, and it's just not pleasant to deal with. So if you can't countenance having to go through the mess of distilling rye, and someone's already doing it really, really well, then it makes perfect sense to buy it in. I'm pretty sure James E. Pepper, the distillery, will be making its own rye, and so they're going to be using a rye heavy recipe. So I don't think it will change too much from what you're going to taste just now, or what you are tasting just now. Let's have a little look. So I'm hoping you see my Coca-Cola and root beer analogy in action there, but it's so different, and you can't really judge it against even bourbon. Bourbon would be the closest to rye in terms of what we experience in the UK, but in many ways it couldn't be further away. The grain makes that much difference. I mean, I really struggle to describe the flavors in rye, but there's almost this kind of earthiness to it, a kind of sweet earthiness, and I mentioned earlier on a sort of black pepper and a bit of spiciness to it as well. I'm going to try it at full strength. So I think this is bottled at 46%. Yeah. It's just really delicious. It actually, I think, is slightly sweeter on the palate than it would necessarily reveal in the nose. It's just got a lot more. It's actually a little more subtle than I expected. It's quite complex and very long lasting as well. What do you all think? Do you like it? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Great. I'll try adding a little bit of water, see what that does to it. Yeah, I definitely get a little bit more. There's definitely a bit more fruit coming out with the water. Now, when you add water to Scotch whiskies, you tend to find a real bloom of citrus and floral and lots of interesting aromas coming out, which may have been hidden by the alcohol. In this, it definitely has an effect, but it's perhaps not quite as redolent as it would be with a single malt. And actually, I would say with water, I miss the alcohol. I know that sounds really dodgy. It's not meant to, but I think at 46%, it just had that really nice warming intensity when you're swallowing it. Whereas with the water in that, I just find it just breaks it down a little bit too much, maybe. But that's personal taste, a lot of people would possibly disagree. Just see. So yes, so I think it's important for you to know about places like MGP, which are very quality-led whiskey making facilities. But what I would always say, when you're looking at American whiskies online, or you're looking at buying stuff, just be aware that there are distillers out there or brands out there who, shall we say, make it a little bit challenging to work out whether they actually made the whiskey or not. And again, I would say there's nothing wrong with having someone else make it for you, but I do think that you should be transparent about that. and certainly James E. Pepper are quite transparent about the fact that they use MGP, and I think that's to their credit, because they don't have to be as transparent as they have been. And I think that come the time when they have whiskey ready to be bottled that they've distilled themselves, I think they'll have generated hopefully enough goodwill amongst people like ourselves who've been tasting their whiskey, but from this distillery. Good. Okay, so we've got one whiskey left to taste, and then I'm going to finish off by showing you how I would make an old-fashioned. So it's funny. Very rarely would I say in one of my tastings that the single malt is the odd one out, but that's the position I find myself in tonight. So we're actually going to be tasting a single malt from these guys, Westwood, in Portland, Oregon. So Westwood have been going for quite a while. I think you'll see on the useful little timeline here. So they're founded in 2004. They moved distillery to a bigger premises that you can see there in the 2010s, and they became part of a Diageo-led program called Distill Ventures a few years ago, which essentially gave them a boost of investment in order to expand their operations, so they could make more whiskey, which can only be a good thing. They're not the first single or American distillery to make single malt. That goes to, as far as I'm aware, the St. George's distillery, which isn't too far away in Alameda, California, which is 1982. But still, as I was saying earlier on, single malt from the USA, it's not synonymous, is it? It's not something that trips off the tongue. Most people would associate the US with bourbon, rye, and so on. So it's really interesting to see how these guys are getting on. Now, single malt in the USA, there's no official classification like there is for bourbon and for rye. So, it's not the same level of, how should we say, it's not the same level of keeping an eye on who's doing what and are they doing it in the right way, because that hasn't yet been set out. It's not something that has been officially put on paper, even though a lot of the distillers are trying to get that done, because they're concerned that at the moment, single malt whiskey, so if it says USA single malt on the label, it doesn't have to contain 100% single malted barley. So in Scotland, if it says single malt Scotch whiskey, it has to be made from a mash of 100% malted barley. In the US, that's not the case. They can use other grains in that mash because there's not that clear definition. And so that's what a lot of producers in the US are trying to achieve, is to get parity with Scotland so that they can gain the same level of respect, and then hopefully sales and so on will follow. But until they get that, it's quite challenging, because they can't put it in the same level of education and promotion behind it until they have that really clear definition. Now, what I can say to you is that the Westwood single malt is 100% malted barley. So this does represent what probably single malt in the USA should look like in terms of the definition. So it's 100% malted barley. They use brand new casks, but they don't use heavily charred, as far as I'm aware, for this release. It's toasted. So the casks are heat treated rather than being completely burnt on the inside, which means you're not going to get quite the same level of oak influence or charcoal influence, if you like, from the inside of the cask, which is good, because if you were to put single malt in Scotland into a brand new heavily charred cask, you'd end up with something almost bordering on bourbon. Although obviously the climate in Scotland would not promote quite the same level of speedy maturation. But so for single malt in the USA, if you were to put that into brand new oak, heavily charred brand new oak, it would just ruin it. Malted barley produces much more subtle and sophisticated, I guess, aromas perhaps than corn or rye, and therefore needs a little bit more nurture in the maturation stage. So hence why they've used toasted casks for this. And when you nose it, straight away you should tell the difference between the cereals. If you go back to the rye now, yeah, so different. And then maybe even back to the first whiskey. It's interesting to be able. I don't often taste bourbon, rye, and single malt together. In fact, I can't remember the last time I did that, apart from a whiskey festival. So it's nice to have that ability to do that. So different, aren't they? Oh, I've got a question coming in.
Hello, I hope this is semi-related. We're trying to pinpoint, because we're talking about other rye whiskies that we've had.
Yeah.
And there was one that I had at the last Whiskey Fest, which is in like a kind of oblong bottle. And I think they did a rye one and they did a malt one, and they were different colours. But it's really annoying me. The actual bottle label looks quite old, like a classic design.
Yes. I think that was Few.
Yeah, that was one. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
From Illinois.
Yeah, that was a really nice one. We enjoyed that one.
Yeah, they're excellent whiskies.
Yeah.
Was that it?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. One thing going on.
All right. It's a valid question. So single malt whiskey from the USA, what does it taste like? I get a lot of kind of coffee and chocolate. Yeah. I'm not getting a lot of fruit at the moment. I'm going to add some water to that too. I'm getting some of the cereal more as it remains in my mouth. Try it with a good dash of water in there. As I said earlier, water seems to react better with Scotch style whiskies, single malt whiskies, than it does with well, for me, with the bourbon and the rye tonight. And certainly I get a little bit more freshness, a bit more bright, zesty flavors or aromas. It's very pleasant. It's very light, actually, when you add water to it. I would say possibly it would have been, it's more of an aperitif, so it's maybe for slightly earlier in the evening, whereas the bourbons and particularly the rye would be for later on in the evening, personally speaking. But very pleasant indeed. What do you all think? Do you like it? Yeah, good stuff. Okay, so that's the Westwood, the internals of the Westwood distillery. Now, as far as I can tell, pretty much the whole distillery is in that one space. So on the left-hand side, I think the fermenting tanks. I think on the right-hand side, the mash tuns. And then on the far wall, you can see the still. It's interesting, actually, the big photo, I suspect, must have been when it was absolutely brand new. And then the smaller photo, you can see where they've added the lettering to the still and the wall. And you can see there that the output was fairly significant already at 1,200, 200 litre barrel or 200 litre barrels, but they're looking to up that by about 40% to 1,650. I'm not sure whether they would have done that this year because of, well, for fairly obvious reasons. But you know, that's their ambition, is to increase the output from the distillery. And there's evidence of the brand new oak casks. I mean, that is one of the brightest, shiniest, cleanest warehouses I've ever seen. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, interesting to see. You know, if you Scotland would automatically see the second-hand casks, and they're normally pretty bogging, a lot of them, but it doesn't matter because what comes out of them is great. But it's sometimes quite nice to see shiny new casks, I have to say. And I think that's the last slide of the presentation. So I was going to have a bash at making an old-fashioned, which you can join in with. I'd love to have been able to send you more whiskey, but it wasn't possible within the constraints of 25 quid. So hopefully you've got some bourbon handy, or you can watch this back and have a go yourselves at some point. Now I'm just going to switch my video off for 2 seconds while I set up here. I've got everything next to me, but I just need to lift the laptop up, and I don't want to do that while I'm on thingy. So if you just bear with me a second. That's me going to the freezer, by the way. You can hear. I'm getting my ice. Okay. There. Can you see? Right. So, how I approach an old-fashioned. Actually, I haven't done one of these for a little while, so you'll have to bear with me. So I've got a glass. That's always a good start. Now, I sent you a little bit of bitters, which obviously if you're not going to use tonight, you can use at any point. There's not a lot in there because you don't need to use a lot. I've got very same Angostura bitters here. I've also got some orange bitters, which is quite nice for old fashions. I'm just going to quickly show you. So you could use if you're going to do it really the slow way, you could use sugar cubes, but I tend to use just the plain old granulated sugar. And I'm going to put about sort of 1/4 teaspoon or so. Then I'm going to add enough bitters just to cover the sugar. So I quite like bitters, so I normally add I probably add a bit more than I should, but I don't care. I'm a renegade. Right, then I'm going to take my muddling spoon, almost pressing the bitters into the sugar. Make sure it's properly saturated. Okay. Then I'm going to take. I'm going to go with the small batch. So I pour a small amount to begin with. And again, I'm going to give that a little stir. Just start introducing the alcohol to the sugar and the bitters. Just remembered one ingredient. And I'm back. Now, this tends to be where I add the ice, and I've got a penchant for round ice cubes. Now, don't do what I did the first time, which was just drop it in there. Okay, you need to lower it in using the spoon. Otherwise, you will get covered in bourbon. Okay, so you lower it in and you start to stir. Now, again, a lot of people would say it takes a good 5-10 minutes to make an old fashioned, but I'm not going to do that to you because it would literally be just watching me do this. But the idea is that as the ice melts, it starts to dilute the alcohol and starts to integrate the flavors of the bitters and the sugar at the same time. So what I'll start doing now is adding a little bit more bourbon. Now you saw how much bourbon was in here before I put the ice in. And now it looks like there's a colossal amount of bourbon in there, but there really isn't. There's probably about 35 mils of bourbon in there. But you're just patiently allowing the ice to melt and, like I say, integrate with allow the water and the whiskey and the bitters and the sugar to just integrate. Now I'm going to one more little like so. Now that ice is going to take a while to melt, but I mean, one of the lovely things about an old fashioned I like is it almost gets better as you're drinking it, as the flavors just start to really become more and more subtle with the dilution of the ice. Now I'm just going to pop that there for a second, and I'm going to prepare some garnish. So orange peel. Now, what I would have done in the old days before I met people who know what they're doing is I would have cut that off and I would have just dumped it in there. But what I found out is that you actually need to cut the pith out of the orange, which is a bit of a pain in the bum, if I'm honest, but it does make a difference. And the reason being is that as you're cutting the pith out, you can see the pores being exposed, the pores of the inside of the skin of the orange. And it's actually within those pores that you get the real kind of rich zest from the skin. You can almost see it, the sweat of the orange. And then you can even cut it into a sort of funky shape, like so, until I've done that a few times during lockdown. And then with your pores exposed, you take your old fashioned. There are, you could burn it and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that because I'll probably end up burning their house down. But you just give it a wee squeeze, and you can feel the liquid being kind of propelled into the propelled into the drink. And then finally I have these bourbon cocktail cherries. there was a point where I was using glacé cherries because I couldn't find any the other cherries. But someone took pity on me and sent me these. And the bourbon soaked cherries, and just put that in there. And there you have it, then, an old-fashioned a la the Whiskey Lounge, Eddie Ludlow. But I will for now, I will say good evening, and enjoy the rest of your night and your weekend, guys.